we've already seen how any hope for there to be one Protestant church coming out of the 16th century to rival the one Roman Catholic Church were quickly dashed as soon as Protestant leaders started discussing theological issues, issues surrounding church practices, issues surrounding the sacraments, and a whole host of other issues. It became very clear early on that there would be many Protestant churches, and therefore we started to see many different denominations like the Lutherans, the Reformed churches following the theology of John Calvin and others in and around Switzerland, and the Anglican Church, the Church of England, which would be its own separate Protestant church moving forward. In the 16th century, we also had several other movements or denominations. There were the Anabaptists, who were a non-establishment group of Protestants, meaning that they didn't want to simply replace the Roman Catholic Church with another Christian church that was working hand in hand with the state as the official state religion. They wanted more freedom of religion in terms of the ability to choose the church or the tradition that one wanted to be a part of. There were also the Unitarians, who theologically may not even be considered part of Christianity, depending on where scholars draw their boundaries. But they were another group that really only makes sense when talking about the Protestant Reformation, as that encouraged their emergence. There was also a movement known as Puritanism, which was not a denomination like the others that we have mentioned, but more of a movement within an existing denomination. The Puritans were Anglicans. They were members of the Church of England, and yet they were concerned that the Church of England was holding on to too many Catholic tendencies. So they were a group who tried to purify the Church of England from its Catholic tendencies. This was especially after Queen Mary had reinstated Catholicism within England, and then Queen Elizabeth takes over and tried to seek a kind of balance, a middle course between the traditionalists and the more kind of strongly reform-minded members of the Church of England that existed at that time. The Puritans show up and believe that that balance or that middle course still stayed too close to Catholicism. And the Puritan movement really begins in the middle to late 16th century and really gains more success as you move your way into the 17th century. For a time, the Puritans under Cromwell even have success at a military level where they are able to take over England from King Charles I, who is beheaded after some of these conflicts. The Puritans are in charge of everything that's going on throughout England for about 20 years until the so-called Restoration, where King Charles II is able to remove the Puritan influence in the Church of England and in the state of England, and is able to restore the monarchy and a more traditionalist understanding of religion within the Anglican tradition. At that time, in the 17th century, Puritanism really starts to wane a bit in England. Fortunately for Puritanism, Puritans had already made their way to New England, the colonies in America, where Puritanism would become much more successful. The Puritans actually formed their own denomination, which was known as Congregationalism. And once the Congregationalists arrive in North America, they are able to be successful in some of those northern colonies like Massachusetts. Puritanism is able to have a strong influence on the development of American culture. To this day, there are things that exist in our society in America that are deeply influenced by the Puritan foundations of much of the American colonies. Even though most people don't walk around today claiming to be Puritans, there is still an element of Puritanism alive and well within American society. Part of that has to do with the Puritan emphasis on a strict moral code, and that has continued at different times throughout American history. Congregationalists also were important in the early development of American education. Both Harvard and Yale were formed as Congregationalist universities to encourage the education in a Puritan manner of American students. So when you think of Harvard and Yale as some of the most important historic educational institutions in America, it's important to remember their Puritan background in terms of the time of their formation. So it's an interesting movement, has a really interesting time within England, especially as we move into the 17th century, and then maybe becomes more influential in America in the early development of America through the colonies. There's another 17th century group that emerges in England, and they are known as the Baptists. Now, I briefly just mentioned the Anabaptists, who were living primarily on the continent of Europe. The Baptists eventually do share with the Anabaptists the idea of adult-only baptism by immersion. So most of you are probably aware that the Roman Catholic Church and other Protestant churches continue to this day to baptize infants, and do so just with sprinkling water on a forehead or pouring water on a forehead. The Anabaptists on the continent, because they wanted everyone to have the option to choose their own tradition, didn't want to baptize people into a particular church. It was more about a conscious choice that was made by an adult. Now, maybe that adult was a teenager that we might still consider in some ways a child, but it needed to be a mature decision. The Baptists who emerge in England followed that belief in adult-only baptism, and most Baptist groups to this day remain committed to adult-only baptism by immersion. However, other than that shared belief in adult-only baptism by immersion, the Baptists didn't share that much more with the Anabaptists on the continent. Instead, they shared a lot more with some of the Calvinist groups and theology that were taking place within England. Again, not always completely agreeing with Calvinist theology, but a lot of that Reformed tradition was present in the early Baptist denomination. Eventually, just like with the Congregationalists, Baptists are going to have much greater success in America than in England. And especially in the 18th century, at the time of the Great Awakening in America, Baptists are going to really emerge as a powerful denomination within American Christianity, especially in the South, where Baptists continue to be a major force in America today in terms of culture, society, politics, etc. Another English denomination that emerges in the 17th century are the Quakers, and they are founded by a man named George Fox. And Fox became, among other things, really interested in what he would call the inner light of Christians. And the idea was that all Christians had this inner light within them. And what that meant in terms of church structure was that for the Quakers, there really shouldn't be just one person at a church worship service who gets to speak the entire time. Because in some ways, the Quakers are taking Luther's idea of the priesthood of all believers to its logical conclusion. If all of us have the same kind of access to God, then all of us in some ways should have the same opportunities to contribute to the community's worship service. And in Quaker services, you would have, in many instances, silence and a time to allow individuals, different individuals, to speak up if they felt that they had something to share to the community when their inner light, in a sense, turned on and they were able to share with the others in the meeting. The Quakers, technically referred to as the Society of Friends, and the word Quaker ends up kind of showing up in some ways in kind of a negative light early on. But Quakers eventually accepted that terminology, and most Quakers that I have spoken to are perfectly fine with that terminology, even though the Society of Friends is the more precise term. So again, that kind of shows us how Protestantism continued its fragmentation through the 16th century with groups like the Lutherans and the Anglicans and the Reformed Christians, and also other non-establishing groups like the Anabaptists or the Unitarians. And this continued into the 17th century as Puritanism led to Congregationalism. You had the Baptists, the Quakers, and other groups, especially in England, who would then become perhaps more important in terms of the development of American Christianity.